this firebombing terror attack in Colorado and what this tells us about not only the kinds of ideological hatred that are spreading in this country under this, I think, often this shield of, oh, I'm not anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. I'm just anti-Zionist. Well, I don't know a lot of Zionists who aren't Jews. I think the I'm just anti-Zionist or even anti-Israel is doing a lot of work in that sentence. What is it that they really object to? And as I have pointed out to you, and I will continue to do so, there are many places around the world where there is extreme violence, there is very real oppression, and there are plenty of ways you could argue we should put more pressure on or we should do something. Now, whether you believe we should or not is a separate issue, but we could theoretically do more. And yet, because it cannot be blamed on the Jewish people, you know, the situation in South Sudan, because it is very tough to make that about Zionism, these individuals who are so upset on college campuses and just on streets in cities across America, they have nothing to say about it. It doesn't even register with them. The realities of Middle East totalitarianism as it pertains to places like Iran, for example, that is not a problem that gets protests in the streets. People who think they care about women's rights on the left have no issue with Iran, at least no issue they're willing to speak about publicly, but endless issues with Israel and endless issues with Gaza. And I think we all see what that's all about. You'll also notice this, and as I've told you before, this was the first issue of foreign policy that I ever spent real time on. It was going on now over 20 years. When I worked at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I was an intern for Clinton's ambassador, Dennis Ross, Ambassador Ross was the negotiator on the Arab-Israeli peace accords under the Clinton administration. Camp David didn't work, but they tried. I also worked at the Council on Foreign Relations. Council on Foreign Relations, you know, they got the Bilderbergs, the Illuminati. No, Council on Foreign Relations. I did work there as an intern. So trust me, I didn't know the secret handshakes or the secret tunnels or any of that stuff. But I worked there on the U.S. Middle East Project, which was also an Arab-Israeli peace project initiative. So I started, as many do, my academic background in Middle East studies on this issue of Israel-Palestine. And so I do have some institutional memory. I do have some recall, not just of how it is now, but how it has been the last 20 years. And what you see is that there are a lot of people who care not a bit about foreign policy as a general matter, but they care so much about what's going on with Israel. And you say, well, why is that? Why is Israel the place? And, you know, we say these things rhetorically. I think we know why. And I think that in the context of America, first of all, there's a tremendous amount of anti-Jewish feeling throughout the Muslim world. That is just a reality. That is a truth. You can even think to the character Borat. I always thought this was fascinating. Remember Ali G was another one of his characters. Sacha Baron Cohen, who is Jewish. His last name is Cohen, a common Jewish last name. Sacha Baron Cohen playing the Ali G character, playing Borat, and Borat became this big famous movie. Kazakhstan is a Muslim country. And one of the bits that Sacha Baron Cohen would do was constantly kind of satirizing the just blatant anti-Semitism of the supposed Kazakh Borat. Now, he got away with this because he never got away with it. You know, the left didn't get angry about it because he never mentioned this was effectively a Muslim character that he was playing. But there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism throughout the Muslim world, and no serious person would argue otherwise, or no person who knows what they're talking about. Now, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, and clearly a lot of anti-Semitism in America, too, but it is worse in the Islamic world, by far. And ask any Jew you know who knows anything about these regions, and they'll say, yeah, that is certainly the case. But why is it that this goes to the front of the line? Why is this so important to the American left? Well, as I've discussed here, as I've laid forward, and I know Clay has adopted this to his own thinking as well, This is a white versus brown conflict in the minds of the American left. The Israelis are white. The Palestinians are brown. Therefore, the moral high ground is set and unchangeable in favor of the brown Palestinians. Whatever they have to do is justified. They are oppressed. They are the ones who are suffering any action, including the most heinous and vicious actions humanly possible or thinkable, which Hamas and affiliated and assorted terrorist groups on behalf of the Palestinians, comprised of Palestinians, have engaged in, is inherently justified because they're so oppressed. I've said this before. If October 7th wouldn't turn people against the Palestinian cause, such as it is, because the cause is not an independent state. The cause is the eradication of the Jewish state. That is the truth. It is obvious to anyone paying attention and who is being honest. But if that won't turn you against the cause, or if there won't be criticism from people after that, there is nothing that will make them critical of this. There is nothing that will turn them and make them think that the Palestinians perhaps should look inward and take a different approach. And I think that couldn't be more clear than it is right now. This is why I remind everyone the so-called glorious martyrs and the resistance of groups like Hamas stretching back into the second intifada in the early 2000s was just a series of suicide bombings meant to bring Israeli life to a halt, to a standstill, to destroy the daily lives of Israelis and to murder as many Israelis, women and children, as possible. A moral person from any country, from any culture, of any religion or skin color, a moral person does not go into a crowded restaurant with a suicide vest on, packed with ball bearings, killing himself and everyone else there because they think that somehow this is going to achieve what exactly? Revenge? A state? No one's even clear what they want, because what they want is the manifestation of and the right to act on deep hatred. And that brings me to Colorado. And this individual, Egyptian national, came to this country claiming he wants asylum. Think about that for a moment. You know, this reminds me of, there's something particularly heinous, and you see this playing out in a number of different very well-known and well-made movies about World War II. But it was well-known, and some of those of you who had, veteran, particularly Marine and Army dads fighting in World War II, it was well known that the Japanese, as one of their tactics, would claim that they were wounded and surrender, and then they would actually have a grenade. And so they would say, please, please don't kill me. I'm wounded. I can't fight. And then our GIs would go over, because our people were always trying to be humane in the most inhumane circumstances. And they would go, and then they would be blown up by this person. And this was common. You see this you see this in Thin Red Line. You see this in Letters from Iwo Jima. Somebody who claims asylum in your country is on that same moral plane. They're saying, please, I need to skip the line. I'm in a desperate situation. I have to get away from my home country. My home country is so awful that if you send me back, I could be tortured and killed. Please, out of the kindness of your heart, take me in. This individual, this terrorist in Colorado, said that he wanted asylum, used our process, used the goodness of the American people, used our mercy against us and against our Jewish brothers and sisters in Colorado who were burned severely in this attack. And now we have more details. We know this was absolutely not just an act of terror, but a premeditated and particularly vicious one. It is hard to think of something that is more awful than intentionally lighting defenseless people on fire. But that is what Mohammed Suleiman, who disguised himself as a gardener in an orange vest so he could get as close as possible to these individuals in Boulder, Colorado. That is what Mohammed Suleiman wanted to do. And he believed his actions not just then, but after the fact. He believes, because he has said it to law enforcement, that this was vengeance for, quote, his people. His people. He's Egyptian. You might say to yourself, well, what is he talking about? Oh, okay. You mean Muslim, brown, non-Jews. That's essentially what he means by his people, or rather, the people that he associates with who hate the Jewish people. If you do not understand these hatreds and see how they are, for one side, immovable, and unfortunately central to the society, the hatred of Jews is central to the people of Gaza. Look at their textbooks. There are whole initiatives that have been going on for years to show people what is taught about Jews in the schools, such as there are schools in places like Gaza and in the West Bank. And it couldn't be more clear which side of this issue all of us should be on, and yet you have not just radical fringe elements of the left, you have the Democrat Party itself sympathetic to and making room for this virulent anti-Semitism. This is now replaced the kneeling for George Floyd. You have to understand, this is filling that hole in the soul of all of these leftists in America who think that we must always be having some sort of racial reckoning. I know it isn't reasonable or even logical, but they view the Israelis fighting Hamas as a racial reckoning of white oppression against the non-white adversary here. And so this is why they attach themselves to this. They feel so. These people don't know it. They don't know anything about the Balfour Declaration, about the Nakba, about 1948, about UN Resolution 242 or UN Resolution 338, or the 1973 war, or the, go down the list. They don't know anything about the removal of Israelis, of settlers from Gaza, and the destruction of greenhouses and the destruction of infrastructure, and all the, they don't know. They know, all they know is they have been told the Jews, the white people here who are Jews, are the bad people, and they are obsessed with the virtue signaling of marching around campus, proclaiming to care so much about the oppressed and the dispossessed. And that ideology, unfortunately, also inspires and creates far too much room for maniacs like this Molotov cocktail throwing murderer or attempted murderer who thought that lighting defenseless people on fire was people he had never met before, who had never done anything to him. And here we are now seeing once again, just like we saw on October 7th, there is a side of evil and a side of decency here. And every American gets to choose. The Democrats, largely, for the most part, not all of them, are on the wrong side of this one.